why did I end up doing what I'm doing? There's a kind of I guess you call it intellectual history behind that. When I was in high school, I was fascinated by physical sciences. And then as I began the university level education, I discovered classical languages and became fascinated by that. And I got up to the level of master's level in the Greek language, which I find a beautiful language. But in reading some people like Plato and what have you, I also got interested in philosophy. And that took over as a major interest. And was really preparing to eventually teach what's sometimes called modern philosophy. But then as I got into studying some theology, again, the questions that have been raised for me in philosophy somehow found a broader and a deeper context into which they had to be answered. And so, particularly there, because I've been involved in modern philosophy, I was asked to sort of specialize in not only Catholic theology, but Protestant theology as well. So I had to read people like, Karl Barth and Emil Brunner and, Reinhold Niebuhr and you name them. So then with that in mind and with the idea that we needed to frame a theology for lay people, which would be other than simply seminary theology, I went over to Europe and intended there to study ecclesiology, the theology of the church, and above all to find out in what are called the great fathers of the church, what they thought of the church. So I went to one of my professors, Père Danielou, and I said, well, look, I've had the opportunity of studying the idea of covenant, which seemed to me very basic. I think I know how that works out in the Old Testament. I'm not sure where it finally changes or stays the same in the New Testament, and until I get a hold of that, I can't figure out where the fathers of the church come down on it. His answer was, I don't know. He said, why don't you go talk to the New Testament professor? Which I did, and I asked him, if I wanted to get some background in the notion of covenant in the New Testament, where would I go? He started out saying, well, that I wouldn't worry about. That's not, the New Testament really doesn't have much to say. But at the end of 45 minutes, he's pounding the table, insisting that I do New Testament studies and work on that. So almost by accident, I ended up doing my doctoral work in the area of New Testament. But not with the idea of being a New Testament scholar, which I'm not, but of using that kind of insight, that background, for coming at what we had called systematic theology. That has been absolutely invaluable, because out of that there is a way of thinking which is quite radically different in its way from what had been the way of approaching systematic theology. And what it did, it forced me into the shift which occurred, at least for some of us, about mid-20th century, where instead of doing theology out of formulations, it's out of statements of the Pope or fathers of the church or great theologians, we said, no, the starting point has to be people's experience. Now, we use all those other things, but in order to sort of help us understand and to criticize the way in which we understand our own experience. Is it valid? Does it fit into what has really been a living tradition of the church? Is it truly Christian? And so on and so forth. How that got me into sacramental theology, I'm not quite sure. But for one reason or another, that's the area in which, without dividing it from other things like the study of Christ or the church or God or grace or anything else, has become a focus. And my personal realization is that sacramentality is probably one of the most, if not the most important religious notion that has come to the fore in the last few decades. And I think that's also tied in with the whole change mentality or changing mentality with regard to the so-called sacred and secular and how they fit together. And therefore what religion is all about, not as something here which is somehow connected with life, but how the two of them are intertwined and you can't really separate off. And that really raises the whole question, to put it bluntly, to what extent is Christianity meant to be a religion? Maybe it's meant to be basically a new way of life, which of course will have religious rituals and so on, but not a separated off area. Now, to get back to sacramentality, what I think sacramentality is about, to put it in oversimplified fashion, is that there is a presence of God in all creation, and that creation is really a self-expression on the part of God. It's a revelation. It's a self-gift, which kind of comes to a climax when you get to the level of persons, where that presence can be understood, where that presence can be either accepted or rejected, where there can be a response to the divine gift in acceptance or rejection. And I think that therefore that there is a kind of a speaking which is in things, and above all in people's experience, which is the speaking of God because of the presence of God, which changes the whole meaning of things. And that's what I think sacramentality is about. And of course that ties in with the whole development of theology and culture, the whole influence of psychology on religion and vice versa. So that's been pretty much, and is right now, sort of the focus of what I'm trying to do.